Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of the Fair Housing and Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And folks, civil rights is not a one organization responsibility. It's often an uphill climb and many times a thankless job. That's why it is important to have partners who are brilliant, passionate professionals that care deeply about this divine assignment that we've been called to. That's why I'm thrilled to have our guest today. Corbett Anderson is Chief of the Pennsylvania Office Attorney General's Civil Rights Enforcement Section, a position he has held since 2018. The section seeks to protect and advance the civil rights of Pennsylvanians. Before joining the Attorney General's office, Corbett worked 19 years at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in various supervisory, policy, and litigation positions. His career began in private practice as an associate for the law firm Buchanan Ingersoll in Pittsburgh. Corbett is a graduate of Indiana University, Pennsylvania, Howard University School of Law, and the Georgetown University Law Center. So without any further ado, welcome to the show, Corbett. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Adrian. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you being here. We get a chance to partner up on cases as they come down, and we like that collaborative relationship and hope to build upon that. So before getting into the nitty-gritty of our discussion, tell us a little bit about yourself. What attracted you to civil rights work?
I grew up in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Born in Philly, grew up in Westchester. Westchester is where I call home. And after that, I went to IUP over in the western part of the state. And I think the combination of my parents and their consciousness as African-American parents raising a young boy and my siblings in the 1970s, and the 1970s was just in the wake of the civil rights movement. And so not just my parents, but also just in the ether, civil rights was something that was talked about and was something that piqued my interest at an early age. As I went to IUP, I continued to explore that interest, and I took a class at IUP called Alternative Dispute Resolution. And the focus of the class was really on the racial divide and how the races could, resolve their differences, seek out common ground, and pursue harmony going forward. I can't say we solved all those problems, but it was an important case or important class to me. I also took a class on the history of African Americans since the civil rights, since 1865, which also had an impact on me. And so the combination of all those things led me from IUP to Howard University School of Law, which, as you know, has a very rich and storied civil rights history of its own, with people like Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and others having taught there and or graduated there. So I sort of feel civil rights, deep in my bones and in my psyche. And as I was looking to practice law, I went to a law firm, as you mentioned, in Pittsburgh called Buchanan Ingersoll. And I focused on labor and employment law.
Okay.
I joined their labor and employment law section. Buchanan Ingersoll is a management side, defense firm. And so I found myself defending companies, who have been charged with discrimination based on various factors before the EEOC, PHRC, in court, what have you, as well as other labor and employment issues such as wage and hour and union organizing. And I felt like I needed to, really shore up my understanding of the law in general as it relates to labor and employment. And also, I wasn't at the time quite enamored with the defense side of things. So I went back to school to Georgetown, as you mentioned, and after a short stint with another management side firm, joined the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is where I kind of found my calling and spread my wings, so to speak.
Can I ask you what was it about the defense side of the equation that disenchanted you, if you will?
Well, there were two things. One had nothing to do with the defense side of things per se. One was just that working for a large law firm can be somewhat grueling and can kind of burn you out a little bit. So that was one part of it. But in addition, both at the law firm in Pittsburgh, Buchanan, and also the firm that I work for in Washington, D.C., I felt like there was a little bit of a mismatch between my passion and my talents and the work that I was doing. And knowing that the EEOC existed, places like the PHRC existed, places like the Attorney General's office existed, I sought to try to figure out how could I align my work with, my purpose, which is something we all strive to do.
Absolutely.
When I was at Buchanan, they were fine lawyers, excellent people, a good firm, and I learned a lot there. But often when I was defending companies, I would sort of dream about, I'd interact with investigators at the EEOC, for example, and saw how they went about doing their work and sort of dreamed about being on the other side.
I can see that. I mean, it's one of those things where that the rights are out there, but what we're seeking is justice, and it's usually that side of the equation that attracts you. It's like you want to see justice be served. So I can certainly relate. So
and the defense, just to add, the defense side has an important role to play. There are claims being brought that deserve to be questioned and should be put before the light and examined to make sure that they're meritorious. And if so, a good defense attorney, a good management side attorney can find a solution that can help to resolve the problem in a way that works best for everyone. There's nothing wrong with being a defense lawyer.
Sure.
Just at that time in my career, I felt like my passions were leading me elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's obviously something you enjoy doing. You've been in it for a long time now.
Yeah, it's amazing, but I graduated about 25 years ago. So, yeah, it's been
Time flies for sure. So now you're at the Attorney General's office. Explain for the benefit of our audience the role that the AG's office plays in civil rights in housing.
Sure. Why don't I just back up a little bit and just give your audience a sense of what the AG's office does in general, and
absolutely
winnow down to where we sit with respect to civil rights and housing. So the Office of Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer in the state. And there are three primary divisions in the AG's office. There's the criminal law division, which does what you would expect. They prosecute crimes. They're the prosecutor for the state. Although most prosecutions occur at the district attorney level, the AG's office doesn't have primary jurisdiction over most crimes. Usually that's the DA's office. We also have a second division called the civil law division, and that's the division that defends Pennsylvania state agencies whenever they get sued, whether it's driving on a turnpike and you want to sue the PennDOT or what have you. Our office, if there is a lawsuit, will be the defense firm for the state. The third division, which is where I sit, is called the Public Protection Division. And the Public Protection Division does affirmative enforcement work, affirmative litigation, affirmative investigations, to sort of vindicate health and economic and social justice rights. So within the Public Protection Division, there are a number of sections: antitrust, tobacco enforcement, Our Bureau of Consumer Protection is within the Public Protection Division. Charities, healthcare, fair labor, and then there's also the Civil Rights Enforcement section, which I'm the chief of. And our section, we don't have any sort of specific mandate per se. We have, discretion to pursue civil rights cases in various areas where we see there's a problem that we should engage in or try to solve. But what we try to do is to focus on systemic or pattern or practice type cases or policy cases. And we look for cases in the vast array of civil rights areas, many of which overlap with the PHRC. So that's employment, that's housing, that's public accommodations, that's education, and anything else that may come through the door. With respect to housing, that's a priority area for the AG's office right now. And the reason it's a priority area is because, as you probably know, over the last 5 to 10 years, the problem of discrimination in housing, both present and past, and the effect of past discrimination in housing on economic opportunity in the present has become a more important and more highlighted issue. And I kind of, in my own mind, trace it back to an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic, where he made the case for reparations. And without getting into whether reparations are good or bad, or what position anyone should take on that, one of the insights that Ta-Nehisi Coates sort of exposed and had in that article was that the history of redlining and housing discrimination, in his case, in his article, he focused on Chicago, but a history of discrimination in housing has had long-lasting impact on the wealth and kind of poverty and opportunities of many African-American people, as well as other people of color over the years. Another highlight I would say in the fair housing area was a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which laid out in excruciating detail the history of housing discrimination, redlining, the role of the government in supporting and suborning housing discrimination and redlining, everything from allowing and encouraging restrictive covenants to zoning issues, to the Home Owners Loan Corporation, guaranteeing loans on the condition that those loans not be used for housing in certain communities. And he made a really persuasive case about the importance of housing discrimination in our history too. So all that's to say that housing is an important issue for the AG's office. And more recently, about 3 years ago now, there was an article in Reveal magazine that exposed what the authors of the article called modern day redlining, where the author examined housing patterns and particularly loan patterns throughout the United States in major cities, Philadelphia being one of them, and made the contention that there's significant lending discrimination going on in the Philadelphia region. And so in response to those articles, my boss, the AG, launched an investigation to determine the extent to which that's true, and if so, if there are any companies that should be held account.
I was attending the Homes Within Reach conference a couple of years ago, and there was one session that actually talked about that and overlaid on top of the redlining map, the old red line map, it overlaid the foreclosure rates on top of it, and it was identical. So we can see that even though we have the Fair Housing Act, and we can see that we have enforcement, there's still a disconnect between the reactive, which is the Fair Housing Act and being able to enforce those laws when complaints are brought in, and the proactive, which I would argue would be the promise of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which would probably have prevented some of those gaps from existing and starting. Because the housing is, as I've seen it, and you'll tell me if you agree or not, but housing is, yes, it's that wealth gap. It's also the health gap. It's also the economic gap. I mean, the health and wealth gap. So what do you say about that? Is that the pattern that you see as well?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, the history of housing discrimination is deep, goes deep into our history and existed not just up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed, but continues to persist. The Fair Housing Act, has not always been enforced, to its utmost.
Right.
When people say that, what are people complaining about? The Fair Housing Act has existed since 1968. That's over 50 years now. My response is we don't know what America would look like if we had full enforcement of the Fair Housing Act since 1968. If we had 50 years of full enforcement and rigorous and aggressive enforcement, we'd be in a different place.
Absolutely.
So I see those patterns persisting because of the discrimination that caused them to exist in the first place, but also in some sense, the failure of our society. This isn't any one particular person or any particular political party or what have you. Our society hasn't, I think, grappled with the enormity of the task of enforcing the laws and rectifying the problems that the failure to enforce those laws have created.
I think what ends up happening too, and I'd like to hear your comment on this, is that sometimes, yes, we have those laws out there, and those people that ask, well, what are they complaining about? Haven't we been doing this for 50 years? There's a huge difference between the rights you have and the justice you attain.
Fighting discrimination is hard. It's, companies, people, individuals who discriminate sometimes don't know that they are discriminating. Sometimes they do.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, they put up a vigorous defense. And, to pierce through those defenses and gather the evidence and marshal the facts and, argue the law and put it all together, it takes a lot of skill, a lot of effort, a lot of resources that many people don't have. And there are rights and then there's a reality. And, making sure that reality meets what the rights say they should, just takes a lot of work.
Now, you talked a little bit about pattern and practice, and there's a pattern that I've seen in my work under a Fair Housing Initiatives program. Now I'm working at a Fair Housing Assistance Program, FAP. And so one of the patterns that I saw was that most of the calls that I would get on a monthly basis had to do many times with the condition of a property. And the numbers, as I was able to look at them, point to the fact that the individuals living in substandard housing that were calling because of housing conditions were all members of protected classes. And that could be, race, it could be disability, it could be, under the PHRA, age, it could be individuals being resettled here through refugee services. All of these are under protected class. Do you see, because I know that you look at the systemic end of this, do you see a correlation between the quality of housing and the disparate impact that individuals are experiencing?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm an expert on what the statistics show, but based on what I have read, I do see that there's a disparity between the quality of housing that people have based on the protected characteristics that you mentioned. A lot of that's due to the discrimination, redlining, and lack of resources that we've already talked about. A lot of it is also due to complex factors around poverty and exploitation by landlords and property management companies, et cetera, who are profit driven. There's nothing wrong with being profit driven, but when you combine the profit motive on one end and power on that end, and then on the other end, lack of resources, lack of power, lack of access to and understanding what a person's rights are. Like we said, lack of full enforcement. All those things is a toxic brew that results in exploitation and the type of disparate impact that you're talking about.
So, looking at the AG website, I saw many initiatives that the AG's office has, and one that caught my eye was fair lending. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those initiatives, and in particular the fair lending?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, in response to the Reveal magazine article, which highlighted a disparity in lending based on race in various cities, including Philadelphia, we began to undertake an investigation as to whether that's occurring and the extent to which we could do anything about it. And I don't really have anything to say, specific to the investigation per se, but fair housing is kind of a multi-headed problem. On the one, you have real estate agents and the real estate industry that has a responsibility and a role to play, real estate agents. And up in New York, there was a major expose a year or two ago, which showed the extent to which, through an undercover investigation on Long Island, the extent to which real estate agents steer African Americans and Latinos to certain neighborhoods and away from others. That's one aspect of the issue. Another aspect is, the extent to which banks and non-bank lenders avoid or don't avoid communities of color, right? And unfortunately, we say Philadelphia, for example, it's an extremely segregated city, as many other cities are in the country. And, that segregation, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, correlates with lack of resources and poverty as well. And so when lenders see an economic opportunity to avoid certain neighborhoods and focus on others, either intentionally or unintentionally, that also affects people of color who live in those neighborhoods. And so, apart from real estate agents avoiding those neighborhoods or, forcing people or encouraging people to only live in those neighborhoods through steering, the wealth building opportunities of people in those neighborhoods to get home repair loans, to refinance, to move out of an apartment and move into a home of their own, to move out of that area and to a suburban neighborhood. That's affected by the extent to which the lending community, banks, non-banks, market their services to the people in those neighborhoods. And when they do, give them a fair deal, because that's another issue is sometimes there are lenders who will focus on these neighborhoods, but will engage in predatory lending.
And so let me ask you this final question. Do you see, with everything that's going on the last 4 years, stripping down to the affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is probably going to be put right back to where it was back in 2015, do you feel optimistic about where we're headed?
Yeah, I am actually optimistic, Adrian. I have a long-running debate with my mother, of all people, about how much that optimism is warranted. When I look at her, she's a person who, she was born in the early 1950s, came of age in the 60s. And, what she tells me is that, when I was born in 1970, that she was super hopeful. Again, this is in the wake of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Within the prior, 6 years, all the major laws that we're talking about were passed. The Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68. there was blue skies and an open road ahead. Talk to her now, and especially after the last 4 years, she's deeply disappointed. And, it's heartbreaking. I came of age in the 70s and 80s, and, I have a different point of view, and I see that things have changed. We've had progress over the last, 10, 20, 30, 40, 200 years. There has been progress. Sometimes it's in fits and starts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's 2 steps ahead, 1 step back. And maybe we're in that position right now where we've taken a couple steps ahead. We've come back a little bit. But I do believe that the arc of history bends toward justice as long as we help to make it bend. And I do see the trend being more opportunity and civil rights becoming more ingrained in everything that we do. Not for the benefit of any one particular race or any one particular group or any one particular gender, but for the benefit of all of us. I'm reminded of a book that I read recently called Sharing the Prize by an author named Gavin Wright, as I recall. And the book talks about how after the Civil Rights Revolution in the 60s, the South became a real a region of growth for the country. Desegregation of their schools, particularly in the 70s after the massive resistance ended, accelerated faster than in the North. The Great Migration, where, in the early 20th century, in response to a lack of opportunity and discrimination in the South and more opportunity in the North, African Americans left the South in large numbers for that opportunity in northern cities. That started to reverse itself beginning in the 1970s. And so since 1970 or so, there's been a net migration back to the South, particularly of college-educated African Americans. The economic growth of the South has outpaced that of the North. Elected officials have been elected more often in the South than in the North in the last 50 years. And so you look at the South as an example, it's a good example of how civil rights can help everyone. And that's the point that the book makes, that the economic growth and the desegregation and the prosperity that the South has seen in the last 50 years as compared to the 50 years prior, it benefited everyone. And that's I think a good model to think of when we're thinking about how can we make everyone better.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better. What a way to close your segment. Thank you for being with us today, Corbett. I really appreciate having you on, and definitely will be calling on you again as we move to this next 4 years to see how things have changed and how things have progressed, and call on you as well for some partnership ventures as we move forward. So thank you again for being with me today on PHRC Speaks.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And so now for our audience, I want to let you know that one of the reasons that I wanted to have today's guest is to show that there are governmental entities working together to enforce civil rights in housing, but also to provide information, education, and outreach about the civil justice as a whole. And I use the civil justice because the Constitution has already guaranteed your rights. This issue we see is that the lack of civil justice. And to obtain that, we need to continue to work and rely on our partnerships. So for more information, or if you've been a victim of discrimination in housing, visit us online at phrc.pa.gov, or call us at 717-787-9780. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.